Today I'm going to talk to you on a topic that you've probably heard a lot of times. This is a very popular story in the Bible, and even those who, never even read the Bible before or don't read it often have at some point heard about the Good Samaritan. Now, whether you know about the Good Samaritan, biblically speaking, or just in a typical moral of the story type situation, the Good Samaritan is pretty familiar. Now, I was reading it by chance a few days ago, and I started to notice things in Luke 10, which is where the Good Samaritan story is, that I had never really noticed before. And the things that I was seeing in that story actually started to speak volumes, especially with what's going on in our, not just the American nation, but around the world. And I think it's so important for people to hear this message. Now, I'm going to just do a little background on the story of the Good Samaritan. Before Jesus even went into the parable of the Good Samaritan, let's talk about how we even got there. So, the Bible talks about in Luke 10, one of the experts on the Mosaic Law, asked Jesus, what does he have to do to live forever in heaven? And Jesus asked, what does Moses' law say about it? And he says that you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So that's how it gets set up here. And Jesus says, right, so do that and you should live. But this man was trying to justify himself. He was trying to justify his lack of love, so to speak, for others. So he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? So that's when Jesus goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now let's take a closer look at it. I'm in a New Living Translation. Jesus replied with an illustration. A Jew going on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes and money and beat him up and left him lying half dead beside the road. By chance, a Jewish priest came along, and when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Then the temple assistant comes, and he sees the man, and he looks at him, and he keeps going. But the Bible says, but a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw him, he felt deep pity or compassion. Kneeling beside him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with the medicine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his donkey and walked along beside him till they came to an inn where he nursed him through the night. And the next day he paid the innkeeper. If you translate the amount that he gave to the innkeeper, it comes to about 2 days' wage. And he told him, you know what, if the bill runs higher, next time I'm here, I'll pay the difference. And then Jesus asks a question after this parable and says, now, which of these three would you say was the neighbor to the bandits or the thieves' victim? And the man says, the one who showed him pity. So Jesus said, right, now you go and do the same. Now notice the man asked, in the beginning, he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? But when Jesus finished the parable, Jesus asked a question and said, which of these three was a neighbor to the thief? See, the man was trying to justify his not loving certain people. But I thought it was so interesting that Jesus posed his question not based off of the individual to show love to, but the three who came by who had the opportunity to love. He asked which of them was a neighbor to him and then said, now you go and do the same. Notice, if you will, out of the three that came along, there was a priest, there was the temple assistant, and it was a Samaritan. So we know the priest is supposed to be a representative of God. We know something about him. We know the next man is a temple assistant, still supposed to be a representative of God. And then we talk about the Samaritan, who at that time by those people was considered despised. Notice who we don't know anything about. Have you ever noticed that Jesus did not give a description about the victim other than the fact that he was a Jew and he was on his way he was on a trip from Jerusalem going to Jericho. We don't know what type of man the victim was. Let's go back to the Mosaic Law experts question. Who is my neighbor? So the man who needed assistance We don't know if he was a good man. We don't know if he was a bad man. We don't know if he honored God. We don't know if he beat his wife. We don't know if he was a giver. We don't know if he was a thief himself. All we know is that he was a Jew going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he had everything stolen from him. At the end of the parable, Jesus says, now you go and do the same, meaning we don't have an excuse to not show compassion. We don't have the excuse to say, well, they're a thief, they're white, they're black, they're this, they're that, they're a drug dealer, they were a stripper, blah, blah, blah. Like, it doesn't matter. We have speaking as people who say we love God, we have a responsibility to show the love of God to everyone, regardless of what color they are, what nationality they are. And it's a lot of points that can be made in this message, not just beyond we don't know anything about the man who got beat up, but you can push it a little bit further and say, notice who didn't help him. This was a priest, and the Bible says that he crossed to the other side of the road and kept walking, and that the temple assistant looked down on him and kept walking. But the despised Samaritan, however, is considered the neighbor because he showed pity. And you have to be careful. Another lesson in that. We have to be careful how we treat people, because it's some people that we despise that may have to end up helping us. You don't know who's going to be set up to help you in your time of need. You don't know who's going to be set up to help elevate you to the next level. Because again, we don't know anything about the victim. We don't know anything about the man who was beat up. For all we know, he may have had a prejudice against Samaritans, but who helped him? It was a Samaritan. So we have to be very careful about the way we look at people and trying to justify reasons. You ever notice we don't look for reasons to love people? We look for reasons to justify ourselves, why we shouldn't have to help them, why we shouldn't have to do this. This Samaritan gave 2 days pay, 2 days worth of work to the innkeeper for the man to be there and rest and nurse back the health. How many of us really, we honestly don't even like to give money to the people on the side of the street. And if somebody, is asking for help, someone that you might know personally in need, we can, some of the times we have a judgmental tendency. Now I understand when you have people who just don't want to do for themselves and you just have to let them learn. However, how many of us really do have that giving spirit? This man was despised by many people by his nationality, yet he gave up 2 days' wages. He put this man on his donkey, which means he walked beside. Now, we don't know how far the end was, but we do know that he put this man on his donkey while he walked beside him. So not only he gave up his wages, he had compassion. He put him on his transportation and walked beside him. He knows nothing about this man. So just with everything going on in the world, I thought that the story of the Good Samaritan was something that needed to be talked about, because we are in a time where, there's a lot of judgment going on based off of profession, based off of race. We have massacres happening in Nigeria. We have the killings that happen in Paris. And then we have everything that's going on in America. Some of the tactics are wrong by the people, as well as authority. So it's just so important that we remember that it's not really a matter of us to look and say, is that my neighbor? But am I being a neighbor? It's not about, because you see, again, going back to the question, the man asked, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, which of these was a neighbor? So it's not about who's doing right for you, who's doing good for you, who can contribute to you. It's about, what are you doing? What can you do? How can you be a neighbor to this person? So it's up to us individually to take on that responsibility and that accountability to go be that neighbor that we would want someone to be to us. So good, the story of the Good Samaritan is very popular, and people give their own versions of it. But I mean, these are very important points that I felt really needed to be brought up. So, just remember, it's not about who is your neighbor, but who you can be a neighbor to.